Okay, so tonight we're going to start in Genesis 1, chapter 1. And I want to read to you something that is true. And then you can determine for yourself if you've heard things that are different and they might be lies. And it goes this way. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, and that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass and herb-yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is upon itself, is in itself, upon the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and herb-yielding seed after its kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself, after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days, and for years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser night to rule the night. And he made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the lights from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that hath life, the fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven." And God created the great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the fowl multiply in the earth." And the evening and the morning were the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after its kind, cattle and creeping things, and the beast of the earth after its kind." And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." Bless you.
Thank you.
So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and said unto them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it. And have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for food. And every beast of the earth, and every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given the green herb for food." And it was so. And God saw that everything he made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Okay, that is the absolute truth. When you hear something that's different than that, that's a lie. And that's why I say everything that you hear, everything that you see, every TV commercial, everything, this is 60 billion years old, and that happened way back when, and this came from that, and whatever it is, if it doesn't line up with what I just read, it's a lie.
Can I ask something?
Yes.
If I heard it right, in the beginning it was darkness and water.
No, it was basically chaos. There was darkness.
I thought I heard you say it was darkness and
No,
water.
this King James, it probably says it was
The earth was without form and void.
Well, that's what it
Darkness
says.
was
Without
on the
this,
face of the
yeah.
deep.
So we talked about that last week, or week before, tohu vabohu. And the Lord, the Lord was creating everything out of nothing. He could do anything he wanted to do. And he chose to create everything basically in chaos. And it was out of that chaos that he brought everything that was good. And that's no mistake.
So
He
I
did
didn't
that.
hear that right.
Well, no, all the words were there. You just missed a few pronouns. I think.
I thought I heard you say there was darkness and water.
Well, the darkness, it was dark and void, or what did you say?
The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face
There
of
you
the
go.
deep. And the
Yeah.
Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters.
Okay, and we will get
Okay,
to
so
that
there was
stuff.
water.
Yeah, you heard all the words right. Just a few little ones in the middle. Okay, so when we looked at Genesis 1:1, remember all the words? We took Bereshith and broke it up and all those things, and we looked at all the words, and it's a picture of God's house. He chose to build a house, and it was his design to build a house. And when you look at the entire universe, when you step outside of our earth and look back, and then you turn around and look away, there's only one thing that really has any color, and it's that big, beautiful blue planet. It's his house. And I don't think it's any coincidence that he built his house to be different than everything else in the universe. And we've talked before about all those pictures you see of the universe and how if you read at the bottom, it says it's false color image because they're looking for something. They're not necessarily trying to deceive you, but they're looking for methane or ammonia or hydrogen or whatever it is. And that's how they do it, is they give that particular density of material a different color. So it's called a false color image. And they're beautiful, but that's not the way our eyes would see it. It may be the way our eyes would see it when we get to heaven, because if you remember every person in Scripture who's ever made it to heaven to see God or to meet with God or to be with God, when they come back, the first thing they say is, I can't even describe the colors that I saw and the sounds that I hear. It's different and better and more. And what does that mean? I'm not sure. I suspect what it means is that our eyes will be able to see things that we can't see now. Cats or different animals can see in ultraviolet or infrared or, whatever. And it's possible from a mechanical perspective that when we get there, our eyes will be such that we'll be able to see all of those things. I don't know. But right now, when we look into the atmosphere, the space, it's all in black and white, basically, except God's house, except the earth. Verse 2 reminds us that Yahweh created the universe in chaos and darkness to remind us that that is the default place. If we let things go, that's where they naturally go. For people who don't necessarily follow after the Lord or people who don't pay attention to what the Lord has to say, that is their default position. Their own personal economy is going to be that way, and I'm sure he did that on purpose for exactly that picture. Verse 3 added light. Oh my gosh.
Sophia okay? I mean, she
just said something first.
Yeah, she's just, scraping up my floor. In verse 3, God added light to the equation, and I would suggest that because he doesn't add the moon and the sun and the stars until later on, several verses down, that this light is actually energy. And the word that they use is or. It's a Hebrew word. It means, literally, it means a box, or it means together, or it means in order. So it's not the word that you use for planet or sun or stars or light. It's a different word, and it means ordered or box. I suggested in the very beginning, the very first thing he did was he added energy to this thing that he had just created. Verse 4, this energy is good, as in it would be a suitable platform for me to use to create everything that's about to happen. Verse 5, day and night of the first day, it was tov, mazel tov. It was good. It was very good. Verse 6, he created the waters of the new earth, and he divided them between the waters of the air and the waters underground, which would become all important by the time we get to chapter 6, and we've got the flood and the collapse of the canopy and all that. Verses 7 through 10, he creates the land and the waters between and above and below in the atmosphere. Verses 11 through 13, he creates the grass and the trees, which I might add, didn't say created, he called them forth. So apparently the seeds and the material that was needed for those plants had already been put in the earth when he created it. Verse 14 through 19, he creates the sun, the moons, and the planets. And he says that the reason he created the sun and the moon and all of the planets, he gives you 4 reasons. And whenever you read scripture, the first one you always read is the most important, and they go down to the least important. The first thing that he created was, he created them for, the Hebrew word is oath. It's communications, or it's a form. He created all of the things, he created the entire universe, everything that's out there, so that he can communicate with us, is his most important reason. The second reasons he gives is the Hebrew word moad. It's appointments. He created them to keep appointments with him and us that he would later set. The third reason was the word yom. It's keeping time. That's how we've always kept time. When the sun makes a circuit, we know that's a full day. And when it's halfway done, it's half a day. That's always how we've kept time, and that was the third most important reason. And then the fourth most important reason was this word Shana, which is basically years, seasons, and that's how we keep track of years and seasons, is by the sun and the moon and the stars. When you make a complete revolution, you've had a year. When you make a complete revolution of the earth, you've had a day. So all of those things are put in place for a specific reason, and it's typically not the reason that we think. We use the sun and the moon and the stars to track years and time, but we very seldom think about the 2 most important reasons he put them up there, is communication with us and to mark his appointments. Verse 20 through 23 creates the fish and the birds after their kind. After their kind. A fish is never going to give birth to a dog. Verse 24 through 25, he creates the animals and the insects after their kind. And again, a donkey will never give birth to a scientist, even though sometimes it seems as though that's been possible. Verse 26 through 31, he creates man, Adam, out of nothing, but the dirt of the earth that he had built. And there's an Aleph Tav right there on that word created. So obviously it's got the fingerprints of God on it, as we've discussed. And he created them in our image, it says, plural. And then the next verse, it says he created them in his image, singular. And I just want to, mention to you, sometimes you get the story of, Elohim is plural, which is true. It's gods. It's the plural word for gods. And we try to shoehorn the Trinity in there. I would suggest to you, and we've talked about this before, that when it's plural, it doesn't necessarily mean multiples as much as it means unlimited. He is absolutely unlimited. He can do anything. He will do anything. He's so far and above anything that we can think or believe or do. He's plural, and I've used the example before of a diamond. It has, I can't tell you how many faucets cut into it, and you shine light on it, and it bounces all over the room. That's the plural of God. He's everywhere all the time. He is the big kahuna. And then he goes on as if to put a period on that and said, I created them in my image. It's singular. It's me. It's one God. I'm the only God. I am the God. And I am so multifaceted and unlimited, I'm plural. Each day was called Yom, or Hebrew, that's for a 24-hour day. Not necessarily a 24-hour day. It's for one revolution of the earth. Because that's not always 24 hours. It's seldom 24 hours. But that's the Hebrew word for one revolution of the earth. Sunrise to sunrise, sunset to sunset, whatever it is. And why does all this matter? We've discussed before, if you believe the first chapter of Genesis, you won't have any difficulty with the rest of the Bible. And that's not because the first chapter of Genesis is difficult or hard to believe. It's because the first chapter of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, Genesis, Bereshit, the beginnings, has everything in it that you'll ever want to know. It has the creation of God's house, creation of humanity, animals, the universe, worship, relationships, children, marriage, language, good and evil, Israel, the church, the seed, priesthood, the temple, salvation, Yahweh's love, grace, mercy. Every doctrine, every idea, every path is connected. So to not understand the things at the beginning, it's difficult to truly understand all the rest of those things. Let's see. So the way we just read that, if you were to chart everything that you read, first God created the energy for the universe. And that's something that's not understood even to this day. We know there's energy out there, and there's dozens of interesting and fanciful stories of how this came to be and how it continues to work. And you get into all these dark matter things, and science recognizes that there needs to be matter to create gravity, to create energy, but they can't see it, they can't find it, they can't test for it, so you assume it's there, so they call it dark matter. Quantum physics over the last 50 years has come up with the concept of what they call heterotic strings, and they're these strings that go through the entire universe that are just an atom or two thick, and they vibrate constantly, and that's what causes the energy in the universe. And oddly, that's exactly what the Bible says in verse 2 of chapter 1. We read it, the Spirit of Yahweh moved, and that word moved is rakaf, and it means to vibrate or flutter. So the Spirit of Yahweh fluttered, vibrated on the face of the waters. He was there adding energy, and it's always unusual when science agrees with Scripture, but that's another one of those cases. That's exactly what the quantum physics guys have said. There's these strings throughout the universe, and they vibrate and create energy, and that's what he said. My spirit is vibrating upon the face of the earth, and in the context of creating energy. Next came the water and the dry land, which are both necessary for plants and animals to grow and live. Next came the plants and the trees, because of course you have to have dry land and water for plants and trees. And if you've ever pulled a plant out of your garden or something, it's a matter of minutes before that thing starts to wilt when it's out of the water, out of the ground. It's amazing. It can live for days and days and days without water in the ground, but the moment you pluck it, it starts to wilt. It's remarkable how fast it starts to wilt. But it has to happen that way. Well, land, water, before you can get plants. The next day was the sun and the moon and the stars, because plants and animals need the sun and the moon and the stars. And we've discussed that before. The sunflowers up here wake up looking at the sun, and they follow the sun, they twist, they move all the way to the other side, and then they turn around, and you start the next day. Plants and animals have cycles, and it follows typically, and I mean people do too, it follows typically the things of the sun and the moon and the stars. Next came the land animals and the insects. And if you think that through, it makes perfect sense again, as everything else does, because the land animals require the plants because they have to eat the plants to live, and they need the water and the land. So it couldn't have been created in any other order than it was. The creepy things, the insects, had to be created now because it's the insects that pollinate the plants, and it's the plants that provide the insects with the food. So if it was created in any other direction, these things wouldn't work. Lastly came man. He needs the land, the water, the sun, the food for housing. He has to have all those things. So it seems like a small matter, but when I say I read that first chapter and that's the truth, and if you hear anything different than that, then you know that's not the truth. Because anything that you hear that doesn't follow that order obviously couldn't happen. You couldn't create one ahead of the other, or the previous things and the post things wouldn't work right. It had to be in that order. And there are people that say, oh, well, it was, when they say yom, they didn't mean a day. They meant, ages. It took ages for, well, that doesn't make any sense. If you have plants and it's going to be millennia before you get insects, well, then you don't have plants anymore. Because without the plants or the insects to pollinate the plants, there are no more plants. And that's the way all of that stuff works. So if you think all of this through, when they say, oh, it takes forever and it's done this, and blah, 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 none of that makes sense. It wouldn't work. You couldn't start with something and not have this other thing, because the first thing wouldn't live. It doesn't make any sense. So God created everything the way he needed it to happen, and he did it long before man and science ever caught up to it. And he did it long before Peter would talk about those scoffers walking in their own lusts. But this is the same order that the evolutionists claim. These things had to happen. You started the creation this way, and it started in the water, and then all of these things progressed. And if you look at them side by side, they're the same order of events, but the timing is different. So it can't be true. Even though the order is correct, there's no possible way it could take that long. And those things, they just couldn't happen the way that they said they were going to happen. So you think to yourself, gosh, these guys have got double doctorates in things I can't even imagine. They must be smarter than me. And they are smarter than me. They're way smarter than me. But show me some proof. They must have proof, right? To say that, I mean, you look at commercials on TV and just by the by, they mention, oh, this evolved from that, or it's been on Earth, we bottled it after 65 million years, or, whatever it is. And all these things they just say as though they know it was true. Well, how do they know it is true? Does anybody know how they know it's true?
Somebody else said it.
Somebody else said it.
Without proof.
Because
Okay.
COVID-19. Someone
Okay.
paid him $1 million to say it.
That's true. There's that is actually a lot of it. When you get to, and that's not part of my notes, but if you're a professor and you're making billions of dollars or however much they make, you don't make any money. You can lose your professorship if you don't write articles. Well, in order for you to write articles in peer-reviewed journals, which is how you save your job, you have to agree with what everybody else says. That's what peer review is, right? If you say something that they don't agree with, they don't publish you, you lose your job. So yeah, it's all about the money. If you're out doing whatever it is you're doing, looking at the stars or digging in the ditches or whatever it is you're doing, it requires money for you to have the equipment, to have the people and all that to do it. You get grants from colleges, from the government, from whoever, some endowment. Well, if you're not finding new and exciting stuff, and if you're not, blazing new trails, you lose your money, you lose your job again. So
But it agrees with their agenda.
that it agrees with their agenda. It's always got to agree with their agenda. And what is their agenda? Their agenda is unlimited. So it's easier to say what is not their agenda. And what is not their agenda are those 31 verses I just read. They will do anything they can do to make you think those things are not true. They didn't happen exactly as he said. And when you start thinking in your own mind, oh, well, sure, maybe, it wasn't exactly like that. Maybe God created, but they sort of evolved. Or whatever it is you think, when you start saying, yeah, but, or whatever, they've got you. When you're not using your own brain, you're listening to what they say, they've got you. The only person you ever need to listen to is the guy who wrote, this book, this tablet right here. That's the guy you listen to, and you compare your science by this book. And the Bible is not a scientific manual, but it is okay to judge your science by the Bible. Because if it doesn't line up with what I just read, then you need to question it just a bit. Okay, so to answer, yes, there are two main ways, three actually, that they say that the Earth is, or the universe is, however, currently it's 13.75 billion years old. Okay, when I was starting looking into this 25, 30 years ago, whenever it was, back then the Earth was only like 4 billion years old, or the universe was 4 billion. So now it's aged dramatically. In 25 years, it's gotten 10 billion years older. And the reason for that is because if you need to make a living doing this, you can't keep with the old stuff. You have to find new stuff. Well, new stuff never involves getting younger. It always involves getting older. Because if you're getting younger, you're going towards what the Bible says, and that you lose your job. You cannot do that. So it doesn't matter how ridiculous the theory is, as long as you're wearing a corduroy jacket with leather patches on the shoulders and elbows, and you say it in an articulate way and look serious, then you're golden. Okay, so how do they tell you it's this old? Radiometric dating is the three ways. Radiometric dating, carbon dating, and light from the universe.
Light from what?
The universe, stars, planets, all that stuff.
Radiometric?
Radiometric. There's a song kind of like that. Okay, so it's not a Christian song.
What was the third one?
light.
from the
Light from the universe, stars and stuff. So when you are digging around and you dig up a fossil, and you need to know how old your fossil is, do you know the procedure to determine how old the fossil is? What do you think they do with that fossil?
Carbon dating is all I've ever heard of.
Okay, that's one of them. With the fossil,
What are you asking?
do they date the fossil?
Date the fossil?
Do you know what a fossil is?
It's an old bone.
See, all of that is wrong. A fossil, when something dies and is quickly buried under mud, and then it rains and, whatever, water runs through it, water has minerals in it, the bones decompose in the water, and as the water runs over, it takes the calcium out of the bone and the bone material and replaces it with minerals from whatever the water is. So there's 6 different ways you can fossilize a bone: lithification, mineralization, fossilization, all these different things. Basically, it's all the same thing. You're taking an actual bone and you're taking all the bone out of it and you're replacing it with the stuff that's in the water and in the land. So you get this impression that looks just like the bone, but there's no bone there. So you can't test it because there's no bone. There's no organic material. It's just a picture. It's a fossil of what the bone looked like.
All those dinosaur bones are not bones.
They're not bones at all.
like molds almost.
They're molds. They're molds. They're exactly molds. That's what they are. And they're very fragile. That's why they don't want you to touch them. And if you see most dinosaur, you see a full dinosaur deal somewhere in a museum, sometimes you'll notice that some of the bones, most of the bones are darker color than the white ones, than the lighter ones. And that's to show you that, okay, the lighter ones are the ones we actually found. The darker ones are the ones we had to make because we didn't find all those. And that's semi-legitimate science. If an animal dies, in order to be fossilized, it has to be buried quickly. So it's got to be, if you're talking about fossilizing a dinosaur, say a 120-ton, 60-foot tall dinosaur, and the only way you can fossilize it or mineralize it or petrify it or one of those things is to have that thing be buried. Think that through. Your brontosaurus has a heart attack, falls dead on the plains of Delta. What's going to happen to that dinosaur?
It's gonna get eaten up by birds and other animals.
Yeah. How do you get a fossil out of that? It's not buried. So eventually and you've all seen this, we live in the Rockies, you hit a deer, and the deer is on the side of the road, and you pass that deer every day. And every day, there's less and less and less of that deer. Well, it's not because the Colorado Department of Transportation has come out and taken 3 quarts of deer every day. It's because it decays. That's God's way to deal with that stuff. And eventually, even the bones decay because the bones are made of calcium and they're water soluble, and it's dust to dust, right? You turn back into the same stuff you were created from. Everything that you are is in my garden out here. There's nothing that any of us are that is not in my garden, because that's all of the minerals and elements that are in our bodies is in my garden. And God has arranged it in such a way that it's us, and it's a miracle. It can't be done. Nobody's ever been able to do that.
So are most of the fossils from the flood?
All of the fossils are from the flood. Because think it through logically. How would you bury a 120-ton, 60-foot tall dinosaur? You wouldn't. If the guy had a heart attack and died, he would lay there until the other animals ate him and his bones decayed away. That's the only way.
Aren't they talking about catastrophic events?
Well, they're not. We are. They will tell you, and that's the impression that you get, is everything that dies turns into a fossil. It just dies and falls in the ground and it becomes a fossil and we find it. Well, that's a lie. That's 100% a lie. And if you ask specifically any one of those scientists, they'll say, oh, no, that you've misunderstood that. That's not what happens. But that's the impression they give you. They know that the only way you can get a fossil is by burying it quickly. And if you go to any dinosaur dig or any fossil dig anywhere on Earth, what you'll find is a number of fossils, and they didn't just fall over on their side. Some of the fossils are feet up, some of them are standing on their heads, some of them are standing on their tails. They're not in positions of death. I mean, they died, there's no question about that. But they were swept to their death. It was a catastrophic death.
So this one of the theories, stories, whatever, that is common is that some big asteroid, meteorite, whatever, fell to Earth, and do they think it displaced ocean
No.
water?
What they think is it displaced so much, which is true, it would displace so much debris into the atmosphere, the sun would be blocked and things would die. Because if we didn't have any sun for a year, I mean, just a
So
year,
that still doesn't explain how
it
they're
doesn't
buried
explain how you
and
get a
stuff.
fossil.
Okay.
Right. And most things, when they die, do not turn into fossils. Most fossils, 90 some odd % of the fossils you find, does anybody know the answer to that trivia bar question? What are 90% of the fossils that you find of?
Dinosaurs?
Clams.
A clam?
What
There
clam?
are very few dinosaur fossils or humanoid fossils that have ever been found or will ever be found. The most common fossil you find are clams or sea creatures because they couldn't escape. The bigger, the stronger, the smarter the animal, the fewer fossils you will find because they have the ability to escape. When we see a flood coming, although you look at the news today, but anyway, you see a flood coming or you see the water rising, we will move to higher ground. Animals will move to higher ground. But there are a number of animals, most species, cannot move to higher ground because they are too small, too weak, or already live underwater. So the most, by far, the most fossils you'll ever find are underwater invertebrates. They're clams, they're mussels, they're these little things. And it didn't take much to cover them. And they turn, and in fact, most of the clams you find are open. Big deal, right? Clams don't die that way. Clams are a mussel. When they die, the mussel stops and they slam shut. If you find a clam that's open and fossilized, that thing was buried alive. Okay, so what does that tell you? It should tell you that something unusual happened. Okay, tells me what? Faster?
Fast.
Oh, yeah.
Something fast.
Okay, so anyway, I knew this was going to happen. I was going to get way off course. So fossils are not bones. They are imprints of bones. And it takes as little as 20 years to fossilize something. There are guys in North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming up there, farmers who planted fence posts, strung a fence, 20 years later come back to move it, and the part in the ground has been petrified. Because of the particular environment, it happens quickly. So it doesn't take millions of years to petrify, fossilize anything. It depends on your environment. And it could happen as little as 20 years. So don't be thinking it takes millions and billions of years to fossilize something. It does not. The only way you can fossilize it is to bury it quickly, typically alive. The reason you find very few fossils of dinosaurs and of humans is because mammals typically float. So if there was this giant flood, they would first try to escape the flood, and most of them would have some success for a while, until eventually there was no place left for them to go and they would drown. So if you have drowned, you're now floating. And if you've ever seen on TV a body who's floating, or even one that's been buried in the river with a rock, the body turns, the gas, we don't want to get too graphic, but the body will float and it will come apart and everything decomposes, and then the bones fall to the bottom and they decompose. You very seldom will find a fossil from someone who died by a drowning death because it just doesn't happen. So that's the reason you find very few human fossils, is because they saw the flood coming and made every attempt to get out of the way until such a time when they could no longer escape. And then they drowned, which would cause them to float and decay. There are no fossils. So the few fossils of humans or humanoids that we find are because they were trapped behind a big mud wall, or perhaps had just died a few days or weeks ago and had been buried and then were, buried for good. But generally you won't find too many.
I think I'm thinking about Pompeii.
Yeah, okay, now there's a good example. Those guys didn't get out of the way, right? Thing explodes, they're covered with ash. That's the way they are. That's an unusual example, because most of the time we don't die that way.
And I'm thinking about St. Helena.
Yeah, St. Helens, yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so back to the deal. How do they date these fossils that aren't really fossils, they're things? They find these bones, you find a great skeleton in the ground, but it's not a bone, there's no organic material, you can't date it. So what you do is you look for two things. The first thing you look for is a igneous rock, which are the hard ones that we seem to have in our backyard. You can't dig through them, they're hard. All igneous rocks contain some sort of radiometric material. And you look for what they call an index fossil, which is a fossil that's characteristically abundant in every strata of the Earth. And what are those index fossils?
In close proximity to the one.
Well, that's the idea,
Okay,
but
alright.
these guys will go 6 miles sometimes because they can't find anything close enough. Like Lucy, the famous, oh, that's her mom, Lucy. That skeleton wasn't even one skeleton. Part of it was 60 feet above the other, and parts were as much as 2 miles away. He brings all these fossils together and assembles them like a puzzle, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, we've got an ancestor. Hey, I need some more money. It's like, how does that work? But anyway, okay, so look. So again, you find a fossil. How you date it is you find an igneous rock, a volcanic or one of those hard granite type rocks, and you try to find an index fossil. And index fossils, they say, are characteristically abundant. If you go out and dig anywhere, you will find little bitty fossils of teeny tiny little critters. And then you look on the chart and, oh, this critter is that. That means it's this old. Well, who created the chart? Okay, so you take the igneous rock, you take it into the lab, and the index fossil. They will not take a rock without an index fossil. And then they date it. Well, how do they date it? Every igneous rock has radiometric material in it, so they measure the material. The common one is called rubidium strontium. Rubidium is a radioactive element that decays into strontium, which is another element with fewer electrons. And they believe, the scientists who have done this math believe that the half-life of the decay from rubidium to strontium is between, get this, 47 billion and 120 billion years. Okay, now let's fill out an answer like that on your test. Would you flunk? Of course, you can't answer things like that. So what you do is you measure the amount of strontium that's in the rock and you figure out how long it's been there. Okay, so for instance, if you find a rock and you measure it and it's 3/4 rubidium and 1/4 strontium, then you could assume this rock is between 23.5 and 60 billion years old. So that's how they come up with these dates. So typically at this point, I urge the kids in the class to raise their hand and ask questions. And the first question you'd want to know is, how do you know that the rubidium was 100% to start with? Because your math assumes that it was 100%. Every rock that's ever been found, as a volcano goes off, forms new rocks, whatever it takes, whatever happens, and you get a new rock, every single example of that, there is never 100% parent compound in any of those rocks, ever. Has it ever happened, or would it ever happen? So then you ask them, well, are there other things? And they call it a branching ratio. It goes from rubidium to strontium, it's the branching ratio. Are there other things that will affect this branching ratio? And the reality is it's a radiometric gas or material contained in a rock. So there's all kinds of things that affect it. I mean, radioactive material leaches in and out of rock. Well, that's why a lot of houses have radon detectors. Does your house have a radon detector? You go into the basements of a lot of homes and they're all plasticed over and they have a big fan to suck the radon out. Well, radon is a radioactive material that leaches in and out of rocks. And that's why you have to put a fan in to blow it out, because it leaches out of the rocks so easily. When rocks are wet, when it's humid, if it's under a leaf of a plant, if it's in the shade, if it's in the sun, all of those things affect the decay rate of the material. So when you say, as ridiculous as it sounds to begin with, that it's between 47 and 160 billion, that's useless to begin with. That doesn't tell you anything. And then you multiply that by the fact you don't know if it was 100% to begin with, or 50% or 20% to begin with. But you do know that every rock you've ever seen created on a volcano or any other event that created a rock has never been anywhere near even 50% of the parent compound. So why would you assume that the rock you just found in your backyard started at 100%? It's an illogical assumption. Then, when you consider all the facts that the radiometric material leaches in and out of rocks regularly, that it's affected by all sorts of things, why even bother? There's no material, there's no answer you're ever going to get that's anywhere near close. So that seems ridiculous. And you have to ask yourself, well, there's got to be another way. These scientists aren't putting their entire name and fortune on something as ridiculous as this. And of course, there is. They calibrate it by something called uranium-lead. And it's the same thing. Uranium starts as uranium, and over time it decays into lead-208. So as the uranium decays, you can measure it. You measure the lead-208 in the rock, and they make the guess. The half-life is about 4.5 billion years, they say, from going to uranium to lead-208. And that's a little easier, so they calibrate the rubidium strontium with the lead uranium. But the only problem with that is uranium is extremely volatile, as you've probably heard. You don't want to have a box of uranium in your bedroom because it gives off radiation. Well, when it's giving off radiation, it's changing the branching ratio. Uranium is easily affected by water, by humidity, by solar flares, by the Van Allen radiation belt. All of these things affect the decay rate of the uranium into lead. Okay, so we'll give them all that, say that's fine. But lead does this weird thing. Lead is actually, normal lead is lead-206, they call it, as 206 electrons or neutrons. But lead has this weird property where it will capture free neutrons. So as there's neutrons floating around the air, your lead-206 will capture them and can go to 207 or to 208. So when you measure your rock and your lead-208, you have no way to know if it's captured free neutrons or if it's decayed. You don't know anything about it. So then they can calibrate that with potassium argon. And it's the same story except worse. Potassium argon is even worse. So you look at those things and you think to yourself, this is how they've determined the age of the universe? And you can take some heart in knowing that, no, that's not all. They have to look at their little chart with the index fossils, and that's kind of how they do it. Well, how did they do the index fossils? The timing on the index fossils was made by the radiometric dating. And I know that might sound circular to you, but it doesn't to them. And it's interesting that no radiometric lab will accept, absolutely will not accept a rock without the index fossil, because the index fossil tells them how old it is. So they need to make sure it falls within the range of that index fossil. And that might seem a little cheesy. So when we went to the moon, we brought back a bunch of moon rocks. There was no index fossil. There was no igneous rock. All they had was the moon rocks. So they sent these moon rocks to 5 different labs and had them tested in 7 different ways. And the results were conclusive. These rocks were either 2 million or 8 million or 40 million or 4 billion or 18 billion years old. We know that conclusively. And they say it with a straight face. Could you imagine on your math test if you were asked what
2 + 2.
Yeah, well, what's the square root of 947 million? And you put somewhere between 2 and 12 billion, and you got an A, because it is. That's the same mentality. Okay, so imagine for a second hanging your eternity on these lies. They don't even make sense. They're completely illogical. Okay, well, forget about that. Let's say they made a little mistake on that. So then we can go to the whole carbon dating thing. Carbon dating. Carbon-14 is created in the atmosphere. The sun sends radiation down through the atmosphere. It hits carbon-12 atoms. The radiation converts them to carbon-14, which become radioactive. Those fall to the ground. Plants absorb them. People eat animals who have eaten the plants, or people eat the plants direct and forget the whole animal interchange. So we have carbon-14, animals have carbon-14, plants have carbon-14. Every piece of living material on planet Earth has carbon-14 in it. And this guy won a Nobel Prize for this. Willard Libby won the Nobel Prize for finding the half-life of carbon-14 and finding out that it was in all organic material. And the half-life of carbon-14 is said to be 5,730 years. Exactly. So we can measure any plant, any animal, anything organic on Earth, measure the amount of carbon-14 and determine exactly how old it is. Up to, say, by the time you get to the 30-second half-life, it's so small it's hard to measure. So say up to about 29,000 years, we can know conclusively how old that thing is. Except for a couple of problems. The amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere has been constant over the years, right? Everybody knows that. This happens because the carbon-14 that decays is equal to the carbon-14 that is formed from the radiation. And it reaches what you call a steady state. So that's why it makes it possible for us to check the carbon in any living or recently dead being and find out how old they are. Except it hasn't reached that steady state yet. Science knows that it takes about 30,000 years for carbon-14, carbon-12, carbon-14 exchange to reach the steady state where it will always be the same. And we're only about 20% of the way there now. Which, as sort of a sidelight, would indicate an age of maybe about 6,000 years for Earth. But we don't want to ask them that. So we don't know what the steady state is, so you don't know what the starting amount was in your plant, animal, or whatever it is. So you have to assume that the decay rate of this carbon-14 is always going to be the same if you're going to measure it, right? Except that solar flares, cloud cover, shade from plants, humidity, like I say, the Van Allen radiation belt, all of those things affect the decay rate of your carbon-14, and carbon-14 leaches in and out of organic material regularly. So you don't really know the decay rate either. But if you assume there's no contamination, it's still extremely leachable. You can wash carbon-14 out of a plant, out of a body, with water. You can leach it. Okay. So if we looked at some of the things that their experts had said, this should be fun. John Anderson, writing in the American Chemical Society, said, and we can assume he's not a Christian, decay rates for carbon-14 could have actually varied in the past to an extent which would render invalid most radiocarbon ages. Science Magazine, volume 130, cites living mollusks, living shellfish, as 2,300 years old using carbon-14. Nature Magazine, volume 225, records Mortar Nacastle, known to be 787 years old, as 7,370 years old. The Antarctic Journal of the United States, volume 6, reports the carbon date of 13,000 years to freshly killed seals that they had for dinner. It reports the age of 4,600 years to seals that were known to be mummified for a museum 30 years previously. We could do this all day long. There's, like I read that one a couple of weeks ago about the two quasars that explode or hit, supposedly hit and all that. And the guy goes through an entire story, which I did not read, about all the wonderful science and all that stuff. And one paragraph from the end, which is where they always put this, he says, "Oh, but now we're totally stunned. We know less now than we thought we did. We're humbled, and we have to go back to the drawing boards because none of this stuff is panning out the way we said it would." Well, can I just say, duh? Of course it's not. It's a lie. So even when you look at carbon dating versus geological ages, the evolutionists will tell you it's been hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of years, and you look at the carbon dating of things, which is not accurate at all, what you get is, for instance, a coal seam that carbon dates at 1480 years old. You know, your geology teacher tells you it's 1480 years old, but your evolution teacher tells you it's 100 million years old. Well, which is it? Can't be both. Carbon date of 11,000 years for woolly mammoths, because woolly mammoths have been quick frozen. Those are not fossils. That's the actual animal, just like you pulled it out of your freezer. You can date all that stuff. You could grow another one, and they're actually talking about doing that. It dates to 11,000 years old, but the archaeology department tells you that woolly mammoth is 100 to 200,000 years old. Well, which is it? Okay, so we've covered two of the things that they use to tell you how old the universe is, and both of them have been, calling them pretty weak is being extremely generous. These are flat out lies for no other reason than to discredit the Bible and to make themselves wealthy and important. The third way is they say, okay, look, these stars are 200 million light years away, and we can see them. Okay, well, if they're 200 million light years away and we can see them, and they look at you like you're the stupidest person on earth because they have to explain this to you, then that means, you stupid Christian, that it took 200,000 years for the light to reach us. Okay, it sounds smart. Two things. One, if God created the earth, do you suspect, or the universe, he couldn't create the light between the stars and you? Okay, that's assuming you even buy into the fact that it's really 200 million or 4 billion or whatever it is light years away. Do you know how they prove that? They can't. And we talked about this the other day. I put Kevin on the spot. How do you sail? Well, you look at different, my dad's house is here and the lighthouse is there, and I triangulate back to the beach. That's exactly how you sail, right? You find an object and you get another object and you triangulate the position out there. So that's what they do, is they have known since the 50s or 40s how far the moon is from us, because they were able to shoot a laser up and bounce it back. And my dad used to do this all the time in the 60s. That was part of his job. They put a mirror on the moon, and he'd shoot the laser up there and bounce it back. So you could tell to within the millimeter how far that moon was. So now we know how far the moon is from General Motors in Santa Barbara, and we can triangulate another object that we can see. Well, as that triangulation becomes small, it becomes inaccurate. So pretty soon it's just a straight line. So you have to find a further. So what you do is you triangulate between your office in Santa Barbara and the moon and something out there, maybe the sun. Now we think we know that distance, so we can triangulate from my office in Santa Barbara to the sun to something else we see. And then we can figure that out. Then we can triangulate from here to there to something else. And that's essentially how they figure this stuff out. Well, it's inaccurate when you get past 40 light years because all the lines are too flat. You can't, it's just a line. There's no triangulation anymore. But light bends. It speeds up, it slows down. It slows down underwater, it speeds up in the vacuum of space. Gravity can bend light. You have no idea how far the light is or how far the star is after about 40 or 50 light years. There is no way to figure it out. So they start back in 1842, Charlie Doppler, or whatever his name was, came up with the Doppler effect. When the siren goes past you, it sounds different over there than it does here, and that's the effect of the sound waves moving past you sound differently. You apply that Doppler effect to light, and you begin to see some stars are red, some stars are blue. So in 1842, they decided to use that to figure out how far the stars were. If it's a red star, it's going away from its blue star, it's coming towards you. And yet, for thousands of years, those stars have been exactly where they were. Everybody's used them to triangulate their positions. So if they're moving in a dead straight line, and every one of them is. So that seems a little weak. But this whole concept of millions and billions of light years is impossible. It's a fantasy. It might be, but they can't measure it. And it's that's why the universe keeps getting older and older and older, because they keep going, oh, that star is even further away. But we see it. And if we can see it, then that means it has taken 14 billion years for the light to get here, i.e., the universe must be 14 billion years old. These are smart guys, but they don't seem to grasp the truth of Scripture. Okay, let me just go through a couple things. This is why I hate talking about the lie, and I mentioned that before. I stopped doing this years ago, because evolution is a lie, and I'm sick of talking about it. And it's all of those things that I just mentioned to you, that those are the lies. And it's a good thing to know, I suppose, and it's a good thing to be able to say, oh, that's crazy, that's a lie, I don't want to believe that. So ask them questions like this. If the universe is billions and billions of years old, and the earth is hundreds of millions of years old, why is the oldest living thing on earth 4,900 years old?
Bingo.
Does that make sense to anybody? How could that possibly be? If the Sahara Desert is growing by a predictable rate every year, why is the earth not all desert?
Not what?
Why is the earth not all desert? The Sahara Desert, it grows by like 3 feet a year. After 100,000 years, the entire earth would be a desert, but it's not. Mountains are being eroded every day. As the rain falls, the snow falls, it gets in the cracks of the rocks, it freezes, it pushes the rocks out. The mountains are eroding every day, and we know how much they're eroding. So if the earth is, say, 100,000 years old, then that means the mountains must have pierced our atmosphere in the beginning. Okay, that if it has eroded that much, it would be easy to find, because where does it go? It eventually finds its way to the ocean. Well, the ocean has about 4 feet of mud at the bottom of it, 4 feet. So at the current rate of erosion, you might assume that the mountains have been eroding for around 5,000 years.
And the mud would be deeper.
Or the mud would be deeper.
Can you back up a sec? The oldest living thing is 49 or 4,800.
Somewhere around there.
Okay.
It's a Joshua.
Sahara Desert grows how? What'd you say?
I can send all this to you.
Okay.
Several feet there.
Yeah, and I didn't go back and dig up all the stuff.
Chris, I have a question,
Yep.
and I don't know if this goes with this or not. But like when I was in Israel, there's like all stuff from the time of Jesus is all covered up. Everything gets underneath because between skin cells and this and that, it gets covered up. So does the Earth's circumference change all the time because of this, or does erosion take away from?
Well, that is a good question. I don't know.
You don't know. Because there's like all these layers of city built on top of city.
Right.
built on
Well, a
top
lot
city.
of that is because when the Romans or the Greeks or whoever would come in and raise your city, knock it down, they would bury it. So you couldn't reuse the rocks.
No.
So some of those are man-made, as it were.
Uh-huh.
But sure, some of them do get covered with floodplains or whatever. But I suspect if I had to answer quickly, I would say no. The Earth doesn't get any larger because it's always working with the same mass. It's moving all the time, but you're not adding material to it,
Okay.
so it's probably the same size. One of those,
You are kind of adding material too for those, because
yeah, but you're taking it from somewhere else,
like a baby starts from an egg, right?
right?
Belly button.
Yeah,
And then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger because it eats, but you're taking it, I guess, from the
you're
grass.
taking it from the grass, and yeah, you're not adding any material ever. I would suspect. I don't know. I didn't look at that. What's that?
Your bones just decompose back.
Yeah, it all goes back.
Like,
But when you were in Israel, you saw the Dead Sea, right? Did you float in the Dead Sea?
Yes,
So you float pretty well, right? And you know why?
because it's all minerals and salt.
Okay, why?
What?
Because there's no outlet. It flows in, but there's no outlet to the Dead Sea. So the
However,
water
it's
evaporates and-
evaporating, and it's like losing tons of feet every year. They're trying to figure out how to
Add
pump
water to it.
into the Dead Sea.
Right, but
because
what
it's gonna
doesn't
go
leave
round.
are the minerals,
Mhm.
right? And they can measure how many minerals and salt, how much comes into the Dead Sea every year.
Mhm.
Well, if you extrapolate that back past, say, 5,000 years, if you extrapolated that back to even 50,000 years, it wouldn't be the Dead Sea, it would be a salt plain. There'd be no room for the water. So how can it be 50,000 years old or 100,000 years old? You've seen comets shoot overhead, yes? And the reason you see them is because they have big tails. What are the tails? The debris that's falling off the comet.
Yes.
Okay, so
They say like even there was one down in Phoenix that lit up the whole sky, and they said,
well, that was a meteor.
well, okay, so that was a meteor, but the meteor had just, they said it was like the size of a softball,
Okay,
but it lit up.
yeah,
the
it
whole
burned up in the atmosphere. But a comet doesn't hit the atmosphere.
Oh yeah, the comet.
The comet
goes
goes
in a circle.
over, and what you see trailing is the debris that's fallen off the comet. So you lose, so they say, I don't know, this is science that says this, you will lose 1/25 of, what is it? 0.25% of the comet every rotation or something, every few years, because that's the tail, the debris falling. So no comet could ever be more than 10,000 years old, or 100,000 or a million, or certainly a billion years ago. All that would be in the universe would be comets, to get comets the size that they are now. So if comets will only last 10 to 20,000 years, how do we have comets? And the ridiculous answer they come up with is, oh, we don't know, there's a comet factory in outer space somewhere. I mean, these are legitimate scientists that make their living looking at the stars, speculating that, well, we don't know, there must be a factory because they couldn't be millions of years old. Duh! They're not! Okay? They're a few thousand years old. We lived in Santa Barbara. You go to the beach every day, you take your surfboard, you take your boat, you take your feet, and you have to have baby oil. Why? To get a good tan? Not so much. To get all the tar off your feet and off your boat. Because the water has little balls of tar everywhere, and it washes up on the beach, and every time you walk in it. It's just part of the deal. You go to the beach, you get tar on your feet. What's tar? It's oil. Well, where did the oil come? Oh, those oil companies? No. The oil beds are under pressure. Oil and natural gas beds are under pressure. You've seen that, John Wayne, they pluck the thing down, and the thing shoots up oil all over the sky, and it catches fire. Well, how do you put it out? Because it's coming out 1,000,000 miles an hour. Well, they're not pumping it out. It comes out because oil and natural gas are under pressure. That's why it seeps to the surface. Well, they can measure the pressure, and they know how much the pressure is going down every year. So these oil beds are maybe 5,000 years old, at the most, judging by the amount of pressure there is. Okay, so think about this. If man, like you and I, they claim, has been on Earth for 100,000 years, 100,000 years. Now, even by today's standards, you know that men and women get together, stuff happens, you get more kids. Every person since the beginning of time has figured that out. And it has been, and we'll do this when we do the marriage thing and the men and women thing, and there's a really good reason for it, and it's awesome. But men and women are attracted to each other, for the most part. Sometimes, it works the other way. And they have kids. How many kids? Well, birth control is a fairly recent thing. All through the history of man, there really hasn't been any effective birth control. However, men and women are always attracted to each other. So in the old days, because your wealth was wrapped up in the number of children you had, it would behoove you to have more children. And typically you would have 12 kids. I mean, we still know some people that have 7, 10, 12 kids. But in the old days, you would often have as large a family as you could get. Okay, so let's just say for a moment that every couple had 2.2 children who grew and lived long enough to procreate and have 2.2 more children. Now that is unbelievably conservative. But if we use that over the course of 100,000 years, there would be something like 18 trillion people. Where are they?
I know what the scientists say.
What?
They would say, well, there was like the bubonic plague and World War II and this and
Yeah,
that.
the
and
facts don't bear that out.
Right?
The facts don't bear that out. You lose something like 0.2% of the population to natural disasters, to man-made disasters, and to disease. It's a very, very, even though you lose 1 million people or 6 million people in World War II or 20 million people or whatever it was, in the course of 18 billion or trillion people, it's nothing over the course of time. So they make that argument, but it's a pathetic argument because they didn't have 2.2 kids. They probably had 12 kids or 14 kids or more. Who knows how much more? So the point is, where are all the people? Because they would have had to have died. So we should be building cities upon graveyards 1,000 people deep. But there just aren't that many people buried. So if you factor it backwards, if you have 2.2 children that survive to adulthood, they have 2.2 children and a dog, it would take about 5,000 years to get to the number of 7 billion. Well, that's where we are now. 2.2 kids that survive to adulthood to have 2.2 kids. 5,000 years. There's no way you could have 50,000 years or 100,000 years of human history. There would be so many people in the universe, we would be standing shoulder to shoulder from here to Pluto. It couldn't happen. And even if it did, and even if they did die in wars and disease and pestilence and mass murder and whatever, where are the bodies?
Don't they turn to dust and become take up the whole the space, like the comet tail, all
Sure.
that stuff?
To
coming
some
off the
degree.
comet is probably collected
But if
back
you have
together.
18 trillion of them, where are they? You know, think of how many graveyards you have now.
True.
Think of 1,000 times that many graveyards.
Say turn.
What? Oh.
You're into it.
Okay, in World War II, there was this huge tragedy. I know you've heard about it. It was when, and I don't even know which participant it was, I assume it was the Allies, us, bombed and torpedoed a major section of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia so we could get our ships into a place where they could safely dock and be reloaded because it was more expedient to do it there than it was to bring them back to the United States. So we took out a big section of the Great Barrier Reef in 1942 or something. And since then, we've been watching it and we know exactly how fast it grows. So, judging by the size of the various reefs around the world and how fast the reefs grow, you look at these things and the math works out to about 4,600 years old. If they were hundreds of thousands or millions of years old, the ocean would be nothing but reefs. Same thing with salt. The sea gets saltier every year. So you can, and we track it. It's a big deal. A lot of people, oh my gosh, we're polluting the seas. It's getting saltier. Well, back that up. If you started with pure water and it's been getting that much saltier every year, how old are the oceans? Well, oddly, it's about 5,000 years old. 4,800 years old. Okay, the sun, and we've been told this since we were children, the sun is going to burn out. Oh, don't worry, it'll be after your life, but it's going to burn out. We're going to need to move to Mars or something. Okay, we know that. The sun is burning, and it's getting smaller. Every year it gets smaller and smaller. And we track how much of the sun burns and how much smaller the sun gets every year. And we get all worried about it. You know, in 100 million years, it'll be too cold for life. Well, think about it the other way. In 100,000 years back, there would have been so much radiation that the sun puts out, life would have been impossible on Earth. 1,000,000 years ago, the sun would have touched the Earth. It's almost as though we've only been here a few thousand years. We could do this forever. The gravitational pull of the moon, the magnetic field of the Earth, the radiometric halos in rocks. There are hundreds of things you can look at that say to you, gosh, the Earth seems to be less than 10,000 years old. Why do these guys say it's millions and billions of years old? Because they're not idiots. We know they're not idiots, but they don't have God. Why does a guy get in the tower in Las Vegas and shoot up a bunch of people? Why does a guy go to a school and shoot up a bunch of people? Why does a guy go to a school and shoot up a bunch of people? There's a million reasons for it. But the bottom line is because they don't have God. Why does anything happen? Why do all the lies happen on TV? Think about anything. Why does it happen? Because they don't have God. And that's the whole point. Why is it important that they tell you the universe is 14 billion years old? You don't care. I don't care. They don't care. It doesn't make any difference to anybody. But it's important to them that they believe that you believe that the Bible is a lie. Because if you believe the Bible is true, then you might start thinking there's a God. And if you think there's a God, then all of a sudden you won't believe them, which is the whole backbone of communism and socialism. The first thing they do is take your property, because if you have property, you're your own man, and we can't have that. And then they tell you there is no God. We're God. The government's God. Let us provide for you. Let us do all these things. No, you can live in our apartment. We'll provide you green beans and turnips. That's not what the Bible wants. Yes?
I was just going to say, even the Pope said that it's important to having a relationship with Christ is dangerous.
Yeah.
And you need to have a relationship with the church. And it's the church that
And remember Cardinal Malachy, who back in 1028 AD wrote up all the names of the popes that were to come, and he got to this one and said, this is the last one. Maybe he's right. I mean, you look at the way the world is going, who doubts that we're close to the end? And you have to think that Satan knows that. Right? And he's not going to help you find the truth in anything, in any way, anytime. And it doesn't matter to him what you believe as long as you don't believe the things in that book. And he will hit you every possible way he can hit you with every possible lie he can tell you. And some of them you're going to believe. And I know that for a fact because when I used to do this at churches and whatever those things are, camps and stuff, the kids never doubted. They would buy this stuff lock, stock, and barrel, and they could see the logic in it. But when you get to a church and start talking to a bunch of adults who've been Christians forever, they're too smart for that. You know, this evolution thing is, they know what they're talking about. I'm not sure how it all works out, but, that stuff you told me, I don't buy it. And it's shocking. It was shocking to me in the beginning because it's so obvious and all the science backs it up. So anyway, we're running a bit late. So let's pray.